Hi, I'm Emily Longaretta with Variety, and I'm your host for today's half hour with Red, White, and Royal Blue. Today, we are joined by Matthew López, the director, co-writer, and EP of Red, White, and Royal Blue. Matthew, if you want to just kind of start off with giving us a quick overview of the film.
Yeah, Red, White, and Royal Blue is a film about Alex Claremont Diaz, played by Taylor Zakhar Perez, who is the son of the U.S. president, played by Uma Thurman, and Prince Henry, played by Nicholas Galitzine, who is the grandson of the King of England, played by Stephen Fry. They are mortal enemies who, at a royal wedding, get into an altercation that ends up creating headlines. And they have to pretend to be best friends, and they actually do become good friends, and then they become secret lovers, and they have a whirlwind romance that ends with them changing the world a little bit and changing their own lives.
I love that so much. Before we go any further, we're going to dive into the trailer. So much fun to watch that. I kind of want to just start with how this kind of came about and was brought to you, whether you had already read the book and kind of what that process was like.
Yeah, my agent sent me the book in early 2020. I had just opened my play The Inheritance on Broadway, and he thought maybe I would maybe think about turning it into a musical. And that was the beginning of my introduction. That was my introduction to it. I read it in like a day and a half because I just devoured it. And I I called him on Monday and I said, yeah, maybe a musical, but let's talk about the movie. And I called Greg Berlanti because he was one of the producers of The Inheritance, and I just said, Greg, I have to make this film, please, please, please. Just give me a chance to make my case. And it was a little too early in the process. They had just gotten the rights and all this stuff, and so a year went by, and I kind of let go of the hope, and I just sort of moved on to other things. And then I got a phone call uh, from Sarah Schechter, and we started to talk. And that's really how the book came into my life, and that's how I very shamelessly went after after this thing, because I
Not
really
shameless.
I felt very strongly about the book, and I felt so strongly about the characters. And it's very rare that you encounter a story with a young Latina lead who's such a positive depiction of young queer Latina life. And I wanted to be the person who put Alex and Henry's story into the world.
Yeah, 100%. I'm curious for you about why it was that this story was so connected to you. I know you talked a little about this, but if you could talk a little about the personal connection that made you want to do this.
You read a book and it just gets into your imagination, and the act of writing is the act of sharing. And once you share something in the world, it becomes someone else's, and it belongs to all the millions of people who read the book or watch the film or see the play. And I had this sense of this weird sense of ownership over it. I knew that Casey wrote it, but it became a part of me. Those two characters really did just burrow into my heart. And so yeah, it felt so weirdly natural to just sort of say this is going to be my project. And um you're lucky if that happens a few times in your career, that you absolutely you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't try to make this film. And I don't know what my life would be without these characters in it, and without the experience of having made this as my first film.
Yeah, absolutely. What I guess what was the process of working with Casey on this? Because obviously in any book adaptation, there's some sort of collaboration, whether they're very involved or they kind of
Yeah.
let you take the reins. So what was that kind of like, that collaboration?
Casey was actually very busy. I remember at the time working on another book, and gave me the courtesy and the respect of leaving me alone. And I mean that like in a very positive way.
Hmm.
Like Casey just trusted me, and I appreciated, and I never took for granted that trust. And as a result, whenever I would call Casey and I'd be like, Casey, what do you help me understand this. I'm stuck. And really kind of became like my guru as I was working on this thing. And the biggest, I think perhaps the most like, I said, like, making a 2 hour movie is not the same as a 400 plus page book. And there were inevitably things that weren't going to fit into the film. And I think perhaps the most potentially controversial change that I decided to make was in the book, of course, Alex has a sister, June. And as I started to work on the film, I was looking at my early pages and I was just like, there's nothing that June is doing in this film, independent from the book. There's nothing that June is doing so far in the film that Nora couldn't do. And I realized quickly that what was happening was I was writing the potential for 2 young women to have 2 small roles. And maybe the answer was if we don't have June in the film and give her material to Nora, then you've got the chance for 1 young woman to have a pretty good part. And I convinced Casey of this. I think it was perhaps one of the most unexpected calls for me of like, I want to cut June from the film. Really? Okay, well, why? And I explained it to them and I got Casey to see it and again, Casey trusted me and I know that was the right decision and but it was, it was risky because June is a fan favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. A fan favorite for me for sure. So, but I understand, and it ended up being great. So, before we continue, I want to throw to one more clip so we can just
Right.
give people a look.
Ridiculous.
So fun. It's
That,
so fun.
that, that comedy genius that is Sarah Shahi.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I kind of obviously with the two of them, but also with Sarah, with Uma, what was the casting process like this? Because I think a story like this, especially when you read the book, the chemistry, not just between the two of them, but between everyone has to be right. And you nailed it. So what was that kind of process like?
I mean, it was an incredibly thorough process. We spent months casting this thing. We really knew. I mean, look, we all went into this process knowing that the there was a high chance to screw it up, and there was a slim chance of getting it right. And the only way we knew we were going to get it right was to be very thorough. And we had an obligation to the book's fans to do that, and an obligation to our own love of the story. Um yeah, I saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of guys for Alex and Henry. I mean, hundreds. And uh with Nick and Taylor, they individually really sort of rose very quickly to the top for me. And we found Nick first, and it was once I met Nick and started working with him, there was no question that he was my Henry. And we started pairing him with a bunch of different guys for Alex. And and the last pairing that we did was Taylor. And some of those chemistry was like, oh yeah, I can see that working. Oh yeah, that might work. Then yeah, I think there's potential there. And then Nick and Taylor got on a Zoom together and they started playing around. And it took less than 5 minutes. And I took my phone out and underneath the table, I texted my producer, Sarah Schechter, and I was like, that's them. There they are. We're done. And they kept going for another hour. And I realized like they didn't realize that they weren't auditioning anymore. We were just rehearsing. I figured, well, I have an hour of their time. Let's get to work. And yeah, the casting of this, Uma, oh, when I mean, of course I've just been in love with Uma Thurman for years, and that she wanted to meet with me on this film and to get a chance to talk to her about it, and that we quickly realized that our desires for her were very aligned. For Ellen, Uma saw in Ellen what I saw in Ellen, and we saw very quickly the potential for us to collaborate on this character very fruitfully. And so we were also very happy when she came aboard. But everybody, I mean, Sarah Shahi, Stephen Fry, Cliff, and Ellie and Rachel and Anish. I'm naming the whole cast now, but like it really is Thomas Flynn. We just we just got so very lucky with this cast. And it was a result of a very, very thorough search. But you know, you can search all you want, and if they don't appear, then you don't have a cast.
Yeah, absolutely. What role was the toughest for you to cast?
I mean, it was Alex and Henry.
Yeah.
It was them because they had to shine as individuals and they had to really work as a team. And
Mhm.
when I say, I mean, I just spent, I saw hundreds and hundreds of tapes, and I wanted to leave no stone unturned. So I think we spent the better part of 5 months casting those roles.
That's so wild to me. So obviously you brought up Greg Berlanti earlier, and obviously working closely with Sarah Schechter on this. Telling LGBTQ plus stories are so important today, but obviously Greg is, I mean, he told the first gay love story I saw on TV with Dawson's Creek, so he was obviously such an expert in that as well as you are. So what was that collaboration like?
Well, I mean, I was a first-time filmmaker. I had written a few screenplays up to that point, but I had never put them into practical action before. And you know, with Greg and Sarah, it I felt like I owe them money for the film school that they put me through, you know? And they they were incredibly patient with me. They gave me so much support. I had a very long uh Sarah was very adamant that I have a very long pre-production process, probably longer than a more practiced filmmaker would need for this film. But um, they really set me up for success. And you know, there is no one in this business who you want reading your script for romance, for queer content, for queer characters than Greg. And there is no producer in this business that I want fighting for me than Sarah Schechter.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got Sarah Schechter in your corner, you will succeed.
Mhm.
I was set up for success by two of the best producers in the business.
I'm curious how you feel about whether it's viewed as a love story or a queer story, or if there's a combination of that, and kind of how you feel about that, because I've seen a lot of conversation about that on the internet.
I don't really care as long as people watch it.
I
Uh,
love that answer.
yeah, it can be whatever you want it to be. It's still the same movie, you know.
Yeah.
However people choose to access it for whatever reason they choose to access it, it's fine. It's not my business really how people categorize
Mhm.
it, you know. It's not my movie anymore. And it will always in my mind be the movie that I believe it is. But it belongs to everyone who sees it now. So if they want to
Mhm.
call it a, you know, crime saga, they can call it that. It doesn't really matter to me. It belongs to the people who watch it now.
Yeah, 100%. One thing I've been talking actually a lot about recently is the power of rom-coms kind of coming back around, where we fell in love with them in the early aughts, and I wish that they were never left. But how do you feel about that, and kind of why this resurgence of the power of a love story on TV and film?
I think it's always a cyclical and generational thing. I think, you know, I think we probably just went through this ebb of people, you know, getting old enough to not need the comfort perhaps of a rom-com,
Mhm.
and another generation comes of age and they need the comfort of a rom-com. Um, I mean, rom-coms are one of the earliest, you know, genres of filmmaking, and they've never really gone away, I think. But we are living in a golden age right now, I think. And there have been other golden ages, and this golden age will end, and then other people will rediscover them. And you know, one of the things that I'm very excited about this movie being in the world is that like people are still talking about it right now. People are still very, very passionate about it right now, and that's great. And then, you know, maybe 10 years go by and like everybody's moved on to other things, and that's great. And then maybe, you know, one of the things that I love is that during the pandemic, younger audiences discovered Moonstruck for themselves. Now,
Mm.
Moonstruck, I have a distinct memory of my parents going to see Moonstruck and coming home and like talking about it and laughing. And then, you know, when I was in college, I probably watched it for the first time, and Moonstruck was such an important film to me. And then you have younger generations now during the lockdown, and they're like, "Have you seen Moonstruck?" And I'm like, "Yes, I've seen Moonstruck." But
You're like,
the
welcome to the party.
yeah, and that's really how it should be.
100%. I do want to ask you, because I feel like as this your directorial debut for a feature film, also being the writer, what was that balance like for you and able to do both? And do you want to do more of doing both of those?
Yeah, I mean, I where where it came in handy was being on set and, you know, just being able to like lean on my theater training and being on set and like watching perhaps like like we were shooting the master and going, well, this scene's not working. In practice, in theory, on the page, it worked just fine, but now we've got these actors doing it and it's not working. You know, I have the other thing is I have no one to blame but myself if it wasn't working. Um, I really love writing. I love writing for with the intention of directing because I can get incredibly specific. I I try not to think too much about the practicality at first. Eventually, practicality has to come into play. Um, I I I really love being able to envision from beginning to end what a film might be. That for me is really exciting.
Hmm.
And you know, I kept writing throughout production, and then in post-production, you're still writing, and that I love. But you know, as a filmmaker too, in the time since the film has been released, over the last several months, I've been sent other people's scripts, you know, and
Hmm.
as a director and reading other people's work has been so exciting. And there's also something very nice about receiving a story already well told and getting to work with another writer to guide them to make it even better.
And then would you also write and then have another director come on and strictly serve as a writer?
Absolutely. You know, I think look, I am so I love telling stories, and I there are some movies I think that would come along, and I was like, you know, I would love to write that. I have no desire to make that film.
Mm.
That sounds like it would age me 10 years. But you go up into the Andes in the middle of winter and make that film. Sure, I'll write that for you. Yeah, but
Hmm.
you know, but then there are the projects that are just so personal to me that I know that I need to do it from suits and nuts, you know,
Yeah,
you know those projects when you see them too.
for sure. Obviously you guys had released a couple like extra footage, deleted scenes sort of things. Do you want to release more of that? Is there a lot of this extra footage that's on the ground that we're kind of waiting for?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you start to get into the game of like releasing cut scenes and then you know the what I don't ever want to do is have people start to second guess the decisions that we made that went into the final film and honestly I know that there the worst mistake I ever made doing press as a director for this film was talking about the assembly, you know, and assemblies are naturally very, you know, very long and ungainly things. And I think people would like mistake that had mistaken that for like, oh, there's 3 hour cut. And of course, there's not a 3 hour cut of this film. But my big worry is that, you know, I don't want people to start to not love the film as it is. And I don't want people to start to think about what could have been if the film had been longer or had more in it. And we all stand by the film that we've made, and so I don't think there'll be any more cut scenes coming out just because I just don't want to start people. I don't want people to start to take their eyes off the thing that we made and the thing that they love.
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, it's such a perfected amount
Yeah.
of content.
Those two scenes that we did release, they were sort of perfect for that because, you know, I think the Cornetto scene is a scene that, you know, obviously we filmed and it's very iconic in the novel and I was sort of loath to cut it, but I also knew that it was the right decision to cut it out of the film, and then we were really happy to share that. And then, you know, I mean, the speech was like, you know, it was a little bit of it was quite a bit of guilt actually. I was like, Nick did such great work on that, and we, you know, we worked really hard on that scene, and you know, I actually fought for the ability to film that scene, and we took it, you know, it was it was just great work for Nick. Nick, I think, did it 7 times in a master, and then we did a little bit of coverage. And And then it was one of the harder moments to have to talk to an actor and go, so the speech. Yeah. And I think it was just sort of like I owed Nick Galitzine a little bit of karma back. And so
Hmm.
it's just like, and it's just lovely that Nick's great and Taylor is too. And so sharing that felt like a bit of a no-brainer as well.
For sure. Well, we like to end all of these with the same final question. In case someone hasn't had the chance to see Red, White, and Royal Blue, what is the one thing about the film that would stand out to you the most that would make someone want to check it out?
I think it is unabashedly and unapologetically romantic and hopeful, and that it is filled with gorgeous, luminous performances from actors at the top of their game across the board.
100%. That's a great answer. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you guys to our friends at Prime Video and to Matthew for joining us today. To everyone watching, thank you to joining with Half Hour With.
Thank you.
Casey, you wrote the novel that was adapted into the film Red, White, and Royal Blue, and you also executive produced the film. Well, first off, what inspired you to tell this story? How did you discover these characters?
Oh, I mean, I think it goes back to so many things. I was like a child of the 90s rom-com, like the late 90s rom-com. And so I think I grew up on like a steady diet of like the Princess Diaries, um, My Date with the President's Daughter, Chasing Liberty, all of these sort of like frothy wish fulfillment rom-coms about these young people in unbelievable circumstances on the world stage, and all of the silly things and difficult things that come with being in that role. And so I think I was always fascinated by the archetypes that came from those movies, the rebellious first kid, or the Prince Charming who's like a little more complicated on the inside under the surface. And I just really wanted to explore both of those characters, and I wanted to do it in a way that I hadn't really seen before. And also just like as a queer person, like I want to make queer art, and that's what I'm drawn to and that's what I'm interested in. And so I kind of had these two different ideas. It was like one idea was that I would write a book about this rebellious first kid who's like figuring out that they're queer and what does that mean for their like political aspirations. And the other was about, sort of a member of the royal family under all of this pressure to carry on this legacy, and like, what does that mean if they're gay? And I'm just kind of like weighing these two different stories and deciding where I wanted to go. And then I just kind of had this moment of like, what if I didn't have to choose? And it was the same story because they fall in love with each other. And, in a classic bisexual fashion, I was like, I'm going to have both. So I did.
And when a book is popular, of course, you can usually expect there to be interest in adapting it into a film or a series. Like, when were you first approached to bring this book to the screen? How did that happen?
It was actually unbelievable the way that it happened, and it remains to this day one of the most surreal weeks of my life. Because it was, I want to say March 2019. So the book actually hadn't come out yet. The book wouldn't come out for another 2 months. But like early copies get circulated around producers and writers, and people began to take interest. And I got a call from my agent that there was interest, and then next thing I knew, there was more interest. And so over the span of a week, I had 9 calls with 9 different producers who were all interested in optioning the rights to make a film, which was already blowing my mind. Like nothing like that ever happened to me in my life. It's my debut novel. I'm like new kid on the block, and suddenly I'm talking to, Berlanti Studios. And I really clicked with Berlanti, and then I really clicked with the Amazon team. And I think I've always dreamed of writing a book and having it adapted to a movie. I think anyone that grew up in the era of like, I hate to say it, but the era of Twilight, I think we all, any writer who grew up on that kind of diet dreams of one day having your book adapted to film. And it was just beyond anything I ever could have imagined.
And how much, if any, trepidation is there when you take something that you created and you entrust it to another creator?
It's scary. It really is scary. My agent said something to me very early in the process where she was like, listen, you need to think of this as like a Parent Trap situation where you have two twins and you get to raise one and the other you're sending off to be raised on another continent. And they're and you're just gonna find out in a few years what they turned out to be, and that's what's gonna happen, and you have to make peace with that. And I did. And I think it was really scary, but it was also like I had the luxury of choice because I had more than one producer who was interested. I had more than one production team. I had more than one studio that was interested. And so I really was spoiled for choice, and I got to choose the people I connected with most on those calls and in those meetings, and the ones that I trusted and the ones who I could tell had the same priorities that I did in telling the story, which was to like preserve the heart of it and the joy of it and like the triumph of it. And so I was really scared, but I was also really reassured that I had made the right choices because I was having all of those conversations. And because I could really feel how deeply each person I spoke to cared about the integrity of what was on the page.
Were there any like assurances you wanted, like certain aspects of the story that you wanted to make sure were honored and translated to the screen?
Yeah, I think like I said, I think the heart of it was one of the biggest things, was like the tone of it, like the way that it had this sort of like cheekiness, but also was really sincere and really earnest and really joyful and really celebratory. I really wanted that to be carried through in the movie. I didn't want it to be mean-spirited. I didn't want it to be overly, sanitized. I wanted characters who acted the way they did in the book, who were smart and sometimes impolite and sometimes messy and ill-guided, but also really passionate and really good. But I also there were things that were more specific. Like it was really important to me that Alex was explicitly bisexual because I really wanted the representation of of this bisexual character. And then it was important to me that he was also Mexican, like he is in the book, and that he was played by a Mexican actor. And it was really important to me that I didn't want Alex or Henry, no matter how their stories were translated to the screen, I didn't want either of them to have any type of shame or resentment towards themselves for being queer. It was really important to me that the stakes of their lives and their inner conflict was much more based on the circumstances that they're in. It's like if they don't hate themselves for being gay, they just wish, or for being bi, they just wish that it was easier to be who they were in the world that they live in,
And did you have any hand in the screenwriting process? Like, were you able to, did they reach out to you for, guidance or tips or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I got to read some drafts. I got to give my notes on those drafts. And they were very generous about, listening to my notes and about taking my thoughts into account. But at the same time, I was very much writing books, and I was like, I'm trying to launch this career as an author, so Godspeed, good luck. I can't wait to read it. Hope it's great. And so it was truly a consulting type of role. And then as they went into production, I feel like I got more involved in more of a granular level, because Matthew would be, every day working on the script or working on props or working on, this is what we're shooting today. And so he would reach out to me and ask me well, what should this piece of jewelry that this character wears look like? Can you send me a picture of what you imagine? Or what should be the records on Alex's bedroom wall? Can you send me a list of records that Alex would like? And those are the records that are on the wall in the movie. So I got to be still very involved in making these really important character choices that, might sound small, but make a big difference in how the character is being actualized in the movie. So I was involved, but I was very thankful that I was able to also step back and let it happen.
And the lead characters in the film are played by Taylor Zakar Perez and Nicholas Galitzine. How did they compare to the images you had of the characters in your mind when you were writing the novel?
I mean, I will say Taylor's definitely several inches taller than I, which he will be delighted to hear me to know that I said that. Because he's very proud of being tall. But he's much taller than the character I pictured in the book. But other than that, strictly like purely on the level of Alex's energy and Alex's aura and you know, his sort of chaotic nature and his the way he's just like a cannonball, the way that he moves through life. So just unapologetically and sometimes impulsively. I feel like Taylor embodies that so beautifully, and he just does such a great job of packing all of that character into this physical performance, into the looks on his face. I mean, I think he's just killer in that role. And Nick, I mean, I feel like Nick just like if you like turned me upside down and shook me, like he would fall out my brain as Henry. I think just embodies that character so completely, looks like him and then talks like him and has like those like the only thing it doesn't have is the blue eyes, but they sure are sad eyes, and that is exactly what they need to be. I think he's also so incredibly cast, and then when you put them together, like the alchemy of them is just it's so perfect.
And Matthew López being the director and the co-writer of the script, like what did you think of the way he captured the spirit of the novel in terms of, you know, just capturing the tone and the heart of it?
I think he did such a great job. I mean, I think that it is not an easy task to take a book that is that long and try to condense it into not only like a 2 hour movie, but like a 2 hour movie that feels really propulsive and snappy and is getting across as much as you possibly can of this story, and in as much of like an effective and fast-paced way, and still make you feel like you understand these characters and you understand what they see in each other and why they would risk so much for each other. So I don't envy the task he had before him, and I think he did such a great job of making really thoughtful choices about how to execute that and where to trim and where to condense and where to combine. And yeah, it could not have been easy, and I applaud him for it.
I'm sure you've been asked before about the possibility of a sequel to this book and potentially the film, you know, but regardless of whether or not that happens, do you keep these characters or, you know, in general, characters you write in your head? Do they kind of live on and you imagine what they're doing later on after the events of whatever you've written for them?
Oh, they absolutely do. Absolutely. I mean, I think every character that I write has such a huge place in my heart because I spend so much time with them, like from the time that I start drafting and the time I start developing the characters all the way through putting the book out, going on tour. I mean, when I go on a book tour, it's like it's me and it's them, and we are in this together and we're writing this out. And so like they all feel like my kids, like a combination of my kids and like some of my oldest, dearest friends, you know, and so they're always going to live on in my heart. And yeah, I'm always like, there's so many times that I'll see something and it will remind me of a character, and I'll be like, yeah, somewhere in some universe, all these years later, this character is eating that Pop-Tart, you know? Yeah, truly they live on.
And you know, when you see them coming back up in your life, is that because like there's a little bit of you in every character you write?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think any writer who says there's not some of themselves and at least some of the characters they write is lying. I mean, I've so much of writing for me at least is a lot of it is about like working through things that I see in my life, that I experienced in my life, that inspire me, that are around me. Like I feel like there's everything, everything is kind of extracted from somewhere, you know. And so I certainly see myself in a lot of my characters. I see myself in Alex tremendously. I'm very much an Alex. And I relate to him so much. Truly, I think he's the most like me of all my characters.
Red, White, and Royal Blue was your debut novel, as you mentioned. You've already written a couple more books since then, and another one coming out this year, I believe, which is quite a prolific amount of creative output. What's your writing process like?
I mean, I feel like I have to take my time sometimes with these books. Like when I get an idea and I sit down to write something, I really have to like dig in. It has to be like eat, breathe, sleep, this story, these characters. That's just my process. I am like in it. I jokingly call it like in the hole. Like I need to just like go down into my hole with this story and not come out for a while. And so my process is obsession. But actually my process is like every time I feel like I become more and more of an intentional writer. I've always been very much a plotter, a plan ahead type of writer, but I try to become more and more technical with my prep for each book every time. And then I just like, I think from there, I'm just chasing what I want to read and what is fun to write. And that is the ultimate privilege of writing romance, is I think it is the most fun genre to write. I am sure that like thriller writers will say that about thrillers, and mystery writers will say that about mystery. But to me, I mean, there's just nothing like writing romance. I feel incredibly lucky to get to do that as my job.
If you weren't writing romances, are there any other genres that you might have dipped your toe into or still might?
I mean, look, I'm a sucker for fantasy. I love a good fantasy novel. I was a huge Tolkien kid. I absolutely love Tolkien. And so I think if it wasn't romance, and maybe I still could find my way over to fantasy one day.
Now that your work has been adapted into film, is screenwriting something that you've ever considered, or do you consider yourself strictly prose?
No, I mean, I think books are my home that I will always come back to, but I'm very interested in screenwriting. And I very much would love screenwriting to become part of what I do. I'll say it that way.
Congratulations on the book, on every book that's followed, on the adaptation, and everything you've got coming up. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel.
Hi, I'm Landon with AwardsWatch. How are you doing?
Hi, Landon.
Hey.
Hi, it's so great to speak with you guys today. I mean, what a accomplishment Red, White, and Royal Blue has become. Cultural phenomenon. We love this movie. Everyone loved this movie. What's it been like? I mean, just congratulations, first and foremost. But what does it feel like, Casey, to see your book on the big screen, come to life on the big screen?
I've been asked this so many times, and I feel like I need to get a better answer to it, because I still don't think it's sunk in. And I'm literally here talking to you probably 7 months since the movie came out. And I've seen it, I don't know how many times, and it still is so surreal, because it is just such a beautifully faithful adaptation that it is kind of hard to process like things from my imagination being on a screen. I mean, it feels, I think, incredibly humbling and incredibly encouraging to me as a artist. Hopefully it means that I've got something going on in the old brain that is resonating with people. And it's just it's incredible. I feel so grateful and so lucky to have had so many wonderful collaborators on this, from Matthew to the producers to the cast, who are 1000% one of like my favorite groups of people in the world. It's just, it was lightning in a bottle. What else can you say? I mean, it's beautiful. I love it. It feels incredible.
Matthew, when you first read Casey's book, what was your initial reaction?
I have to make this movie. I mean, seriously, that really was my initial reaction. It was love at first sight. I loved it as a reader, and it really sparked my imagination and my ambition. I had been looking for a film to make, and I honestly could never have imagined that this would be my first movie. And yet I was just so passionate about it. And so, yeah, but I loved the characters. I loved Alex and Henry. It was just, when you boil it all down to its essentials, it's about those two humans, and they're just terrific characters. And that is the foundational building block for great storytelling. And I wanted to tell their story, and I wanted to bring them to life.
Absolutely. Casey, and what was your initial reaction when Matthew said that he wanted to adapt your book and they want to take it to the big screen?
Well,
What about
I had seen Matthew, you had invited me to see The Inheritance on Broadway because I had just moved to New York. It was like right before COVID. It was like right before Broadway shut down. I think it was like one of the last shows. And I went to see The Inheritance, and I like obviously cried my eyes out, and it was just like so kind of moved and odd that you had reached out to me to even invite me, and like so that was before we even had a collaborative relationship. That was simply just like a, hey, like I'm a fan, you want to come see, and you could be a fan of me too, and then like it was probably like almost a year later that we actually got into talks. And I remember it was the producers who first came to me, and they were like, well, there's somebody that we're interested in for this. Do you remember Matthew López? And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. That's perfect. That's such a great fit. I think I felt like I don't think I ever had a question about whether or not it was the right fit when it was brought to me, because of that connection we already had, because I knew it was somebody who sincerely, genuinely, like, A, loved to make good art, and B, loved my book. And at that point, I think I was feeling really protective of it, and like who would be the one to lead the project. And I was feeling like I wanted to really trust the person who took it on to be someone who had like a genuine deep love for the source material. And I already knew that that was him. So.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit, Matthew, about the collaboration process between you and Casey? The genesis, the first initial conversation, and then maybe any challenges that you had along the way in bringing the book to life.
No, I mean,
Challenges.
yeah, well, the challenges are, is how do you take a generous, here's what I'm going to say, Casey, a generously detailed 400-page book and turned it into
Actually 423 pages.
423 pages, and turned it into as nimble a 2-hour film as you possibly can. And so the biggest challenge, of course, is knowing that there was going to be a lot of things that you couldn't put into the movie, and really having to be honest with myself about what mattered at its core. And what I quickly discovered is the only thing that matters is Alex and Henry, and anything that doesn't help us understand their story or their journey doesn't belong in the film. And it became a mantra. It was just like, no matter how much we love it, if it doesn't help me understand Alex and Henry, then I can't put it in the movie. And the biggest probably controversy was, I put controversy in air quotes, is the decision, is my decision to cut the character of June, Alex's sister, in the novel, because I first approached the producers, and then I talked to Casey, and it was like, look, given the way this thing is structured, I can either have two tiny roles for young women, who neither of whom have a lot to do in the movie, or I can have one role that's every time she shows up, she's got a gangbuster scene. And we decided to do that. And Rachel Hilson, is, and her great performance as a result of that. But that was an example of me going to Casey and saying, look, I'm going to do something that's going to be kind of maybe potentially painful for you. Here's the reason I'm doing it. And I was very grateful to have Casey's, support and buy-in, because it helped me out with the fans a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, I bet. No, I bet. And I feel like, LGBTQ plus representation media has seen significant growth over the past few years. How do you both, I guess, Casey, to you first, how do you hope Red, White, and Royal Blue will contribute to the landscape as a film adaptation?
I mean, I think that hopefully it broadens a lot of people's ideas of what market there is for different kinds of stories. I think sometimes it's unfortunately really difficult to convince, like the people who sign the checks and the gatekeepers in film and Hollywood, even in publishing of books, that it's worth the financial risk or it's worth the risk of labor to publish or to put out a queer story. And I think somebody has to demonstrate that like there's so many people that will love this if it's good. That like it can spread out beyond the confines of people who can directly relate to that identity or to that experience if it's really good. And if it's made with a lot of care and if it's just well produced and beautiful and has a great cast. I mean, you invest all of the resources in making something good that people are really hungry for a lot of different kinds of stories. And so I hope that means that we can get like, I would love to see like a rom-com with a trans protagonist or a trans love interest. I would love to see, more rom-coms with queer people, with more lesbian rom-coms, like more of everything. And I really hope it is just like I hope that one day we look back and this is just like one of many and it is part of like a wave coming up to carry all of these boats out to the rom-com lovers of the world.
Absolutely. Round of applause for that. Matthew?
I can't improve on Casey's answer.
I know, right?
I agree with it. I agree with it completely.
That was really good, Casey. That was a really good answer.
Thanks.
That's great. So what's next for you, Matthew? What's on the agenda for next?
I'm working on a couple of theater projects right now, which is really exciting to get back into theater. I have some productions that are scheduled for later this year and next year as well in London, which is very, very nice to be able to return to. I'm developing some television right now. I'm looking for other projects to direct. I'm just sort of I am in the receiving mode these days, and that's a very fun.
It all.
Yeah, that's a very fun place to be.
It's a fun. Casey, any other adaptations in the future that we can?
I mean, I'm like putting the things into motion. I've got some. The gears are turning, but nothing that I'm allowed to publicly speak on yet. However, I do have my 4th book coming out on August 6th. It's called The Pairing. It is another queer adult rom-com. This one is about 2 bisexual exes trapped on a European food and wine tour together. And so like as soon as we are done with, I'm going directly from this interview and this day back into like full-scale book promo for a book coming out later this summer. And so it's a really exciting time for me. I love this book and it feels really good to be kind of back on the horse of books. I haven't put out a new book since 2022, so I'm ready to get back in there.
Absolutely. And we're definitely looking forward to it. All right, last question for you both. What is one scene from the book that you are most excited about seeing come to life on the big screen?
Okay, it was like I was excited to see it, and I also felt so apologetic that it had to happen. But the turkeys, the turkeys, I will never forget Matthew texting me a picture of a live turkey, like in a bathroom, I think, or something, and being like, I cannot believe I have put like at least a dozen adult people through wrangling a turkey today because of an idea that I had one afternoon at my office job and was like, wouldn't it be so funny if I put this in the book?
Careful what you write, because it might
Yeah.
end up on screen. I would say also that Casey in the book wrote 2 turkeys, and I was like, well, we're gonna do 1.
We got one bird
I'm only
actor.
interested in 1 turkey on set.
Yes.
For me, it was the V&A. I love that scene so much in the book. It was a scene I was incredibly excited to film. We almost didn't get permission to film there. They rarely ever get permission to film there. And I was just sort of like beside myself. I think I was just sort of like, it was one of those director things where it was just like, make it happen. And that night that we spent filming it was just so magical. And it was just, it was Nick and Taylor and the crew and me, and it was just such a beautiful night of filming, and I was very happy with how it came out on screen.
Yes, the way all turned out beautiful. Thank you so much for your contribution to the space, and we can't wait to see what's next.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for a wonderful junket.
Thanks.
Bye.
Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the film Red, White, and Royal Blue. I'm joined today by writer and director Matthew López and author of the book and executive producer of the film, Casey McQuiston. Matthew, starting with you, I know that you read the book kind of early 2020, and in directing this film and writing the script, that it sounds like you really wanted to capture the emotional response that you had to Casey's book and translating it to the screen. And I was interested in how that said about the way that you navigated adapting it to screen with that idea in mind constantly of just the feeling that you had when you first read the material.
Yeah, I always sought to recapture that emotional response I had as I was reading the book very quickly over the course of like a day and a half as I was devouring it. And I think, one of the things that I think marks the collective response to the book around the world is that Casey wrote characters who really sort of burrow into people's hearts. And this, seemingly this premise that shouldn't elicit such emotions from us, and yet it absolutely does. And so it was always about the feels. I mean, I always knew that, we would get from A to B to C to D and I'll hit all the story points that we needed to. But if we couldn't find the emotional core of the book in the movie, we would have failed.
I love that. And off the back of that, Casey, I was interested when you were writing the book, if you were thinking very specifically about that emotional experience that you wanted the audience to have, or if it was more helpful in the process just to really focus on the idea of character and story for yourself.
I think it's both. I think emotion is such a craft thing, especially in romance. Our entire toolkit is connection. It's eliciting the same emotions from the readers that the characters are feeling for each other so that you draw them in and you make them fall in love with these characters and root for the story the way that you would if it was happening to you. And so I'm always thinking about that when I'm writing. I'm always thinking about the audience reaction and trying to weave that into how I'm crafting these arcs and when the walls come down and all of those moments of payoff.
And for both of you, it carries this classic archetype of, having this idea of conflict at the beginning and that turning into this real magnetism and then turning into a real sense of like romance and love between the two main characters. And because of that, as an audience, as a reader, you have a sense that they're most likely going to end up together at the end. So it very much becomes about the journey to get there and kind of how that happens and all the details in between. And so I was interested for both of you in how you really enjoyed the facet of like utilizing the genre, but also kind of like playing around with expectations and really making it character driven at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, Sidney Lumet in his book about filmmaking, he wrote that it's just because something is inevitable doesn't mean it has to be predictable. And I think that pretty much explains the story. Everybody everybody knows you're going to get together at the end, and the joy is the journey that you take to get them there. And I think that in the book, especially, and things that we try to honor in the movie, is that the journey is an unexpected one. And I think that, again, a lot of it has to do with the emotions. It's the unexpected emotions when someone opens up unexpectedly, when somebody reveals to the audience and to themselves how they're feeling. That's the journey that I really fell in love with in the book.
Yeah, no, I think I love what you say about the unexpected, Matthew. When I sat down to write the book, it was very much rooted in archetypes and kind of tropes of characters that I was really interested in and had seen explored a lot of different ways. Like this, like this rebellious first son, I think, was drawing from like My Date with the President's Daughter and Chasing Liberty and like these great rom-coms of the late 90s that I grew up around. And then, I mean, of course, the classic Prince Charming character. How do you subvert these two characters? What do you give them? What do you plant in them and then cultivate throughout a story to make something go in a direction that you haven't seen before? And what I think is so incredible about watching it then be translated onto screen is that even I get to be surprised about how these characters, who are still very much the same characters at their heart, can take a little quarter turn and do something that is so true to them, but also just like pushed to the next level or pushed in a different direction in a way that still feels like them. And for me, it's like I get spoiled because I get a bit of emotional payoff out of that myself.
I love that that was the experience. And, you know, Matthew, off the back that Casey's bringing up, the fact that you have these kind of two different archetypes of characters, it also means that as a filmmaker, you have two different worlds to build out visually, and they really kind of have their own styles and flourish. And in essence, almost a little bit more with Alex, because you have his world as it is in the day to day, and then you have his family home down in Texas, which gives you yet another space to play with. And so when you were thinking about the way that you wanted to build both of these worlds as different visual spaces, how did you set about starting that and figuring out all the details?
It really started first with conversations with my production designer, and you know, in adapting the novel, I knew every screenwriter wants, I think, at some point in their career to write the words "interior Oval Office." That was an amazing thing to be able to play with as a writer, and then interior Buckingham Palace. And I remember saying to people, I said, "Listen, I can boil this down to like the fact that I'm writing a script that has both scenes set inside the Oval Office and inside Buckingham Palace." And you know, and then when you turn that into actual filmmaking, yeah, the first conversations I had with my production designer are like, how do we differentiate the two spaces, the two worlds, and yet also deliver, you know, the grandeur of them. You know, there is genuine literal majesty to all these palaces, and then there is sort of the grandeur of the White House and DC. But most importantly, we couldn't just sort of show pretty rooms. What I always said about this film was that it was young people in old buildings, and that the youth, the energy of youth, the rebelliousness of youth, you actually have to watch these two young men straining against the confines of these beautiful spaces that they're in.
Was that similar for you, Casey? Because obviously you're building these two worlds in the world of literature, so it's a very different approach and way that you're doing it. And so how was the way that you thought about building these two different worlds on the page around each of the characters?
I mean, it was really, honestly, it was a lot of research, but it was really fun, nerdy research. I mean, I'm really fascinated with like the idea of the gilded cage, and B, the idea of these secret rooms where the most important things in history happen and nobody's even allowed to see what the inside of the room looks like Buckingham Palace, or like parts of the White House. And I'm nosy. So it was really fun to get to do the research where I was spending hours on like a 3D historical map of the White House, and like here's each room and what it has been throughout the decades to different administrations. And you know, like the solarium on the roof of the White House was once like a room, I think it was Taft's family slept in it on hot days because it had like no windows and they didn't have air conditioning, and it was DC, and so the breeze would come through and waft the curtains and cool his family down on hot nights. I mean, that kind of stuff is, I eat it up. It's delicious. And so it was so much, it was a challenge, but it was a really delightful challenge to do all of that research. And I mean, probably to a fault, wanted to put every morsel of that in. But I think that's what makes it such like a rich playground to get to explore, and for the reader to really immerse themselves in and feel like they're inside of. It's really hard to make these sort of hyper real fantastical worlds feel relatable and accessible to a reader who's, you know, a person in the world. And so I find the more details you give it, the more grounded it feels, the more it feels like something you can step inside of. And so the work pays off in that way.
It's also super interesting because you have these two characters that are living in this world of privilege, and yet it's also a place that is a connective space for them, and it's also something that's very different because Alex doesn't come from that background originally. He comes from more of a working class background in Texas, but at the same time, he's now the first son of the president of the United States, and so he is existing in that bubble. And I think there's so many ways in which they have similarities and differences that kind of give them a lot to play with. And so, how did you both find in shaping these characters that you had a lot of commonalities, and sometimes there are ways that like the two of them wouldn't necessarily realize that they have more in common than they think?
Oh, I mean, so when I first started coming up with the idea of Alex, my very first iteration of him, like the first time I imagined him, I'm like, okay, I want him to be sort of like a young Kennedy. So maybe his family is from like Cape Cod, Nantucket, something like that, kind of like preppy American legacy type of thing. And then I was just so bored by that and could not find my way into it at all. I was like, I don't know anything about these people. I'm from Southern Louisiana. My family's like Cajun all the way back. And I was like, what if they're like just like Texas, like populist Democrats? Like they're cowboy hats and Shiner and tamales, and they are the small little family who sort of against all odds, like I rose up into the upper echelons of politics. That is so much more interesting to me, and that is so much more accessible to me as someone from the South and something I can write toward. And I found it really, really fun and rewarding to write toward, because I got to get on my little soapbox about progressive people and queer people and trans people in red states and how they're forgotten. And it was delightful. And then that I feel like put Alex in such counterpoint to Henry and this like blue blood, aristocratic background that he had. And that really just, I felt, elevated the clash between them in the beginning and how far they would have to come to meet in the middle.
Was that similar for you, Matthew, in terms of how you feel like it elevated like the clash that they had at the beginning and how they came together?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that opening scene in the car with Alex and Nora, and he says, I can't, I'm being asked to compete with this guy in some ways. I'm being compared to this guy in some ways, but it's really unfair because he's had his whole life to prepare for this. And I'm just like, I'm like 3 years into this, right? And so for me, while their lives were incredibly different, and while Alex's current life resembles Henry's in so many ways, what ultimately those things don't really define them. They're defined by their nature, they're defined by their hearts, and there's just these two little interlocking pieces that of these two very different people, and this thing that just sort of connects them. And one of the things that I've always felt this film was about was two people transcending expectations of them, and the love that they have for each other is the thing that unlocks that ability to transcend where they come from and what the expectations of them are on them by the outside world.
Definitely. And Casey, when you were writing the book as well, did you kind of find a natural progression in those touch points of where you wanted the emotion to kind of become more vulnerable and more intimate between the two of them? Because there's kind of certain steps that they take that kind of gradually bring them closer together, but there's still a little bit of push and pull throughout the whole story as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to like good old classic 3-act structure, breaking it down into these little mini beats of like, set up conflict resolution that like escalates and builds. And so in like, I want to say I planned it that way. I want to say I did that very intentionally, but I think it just kind of happened. I think they kind of told me what they wanted to do. They just have this, this is going to sound like I'm so full of it, but there's this way, like when you really come up with when like lightning strikes and you have those two characters that have like come to you, they kind of tell you what they want to do, and they kind of like the way that their natures and their personalities kind of unfold as you're writing them inform, how will you respond to this push? How will this trigger move you to the next thing? And so I felt like it developed really organically for me as I was writing, because these are two people who are deeply passionate and intense people in different ways. And so there was always a very clear answer for how each would react to the next thing, which was fun.
No, it's so great when those moments happen. And, you know, in writing and directing the film, did you find that the structure that Casey had created in the book kind of gave you that natural progression, or were you still kind of playing around with it a little bit in the writing process and even in the editing suite when you were putting together that first rough cut of the film?
Yeah, I mean, the structure was very much a gift from Casey to be, in terms of there was a very clear journey. And you know, I've said this in other interviews that you know, the biggest challenge I had was just what couldn't I put into the film, because Casey had 400 pages and I had 2 hours. And I was never ever at a loss for how the journey would go, because it was so clearly laid out for me in the novel. The challenge really was just how much could I get in without overstuffing it, and how much could I actually tell, how much of the story could I actually tell. And I realized that it was just the simple yes or no question of like, does this further Alex and Henry's story? Yes or no? Does it help me understand Alex and Henry's individual heart and then their collective relationship? Yes or no? And that became a necessary metric that I had to use in order to tell the story. But in terms of the beginning, middle, of the end, in terms of who they are at the beginning, how this journey changes them, and where they end up, that was gifted to me by Casey, and I got to follow their lead on that.
And Matthew, I also wanted to ask you about the coming out scene when Alex tells his mom, played by Uma Thurman, because I thought it was such a beautiful moment. Just the fact that she's like, hey, I'm going to need some time. Let's order some pizza. Let's just sit on the couch and talk. And I'm going to clear my schedule so that I can just sit here and listen to you. And you can tell me anything that you need to. And I thought it was so beautifully kind of captured and played. And I was interested in just how you approach going into a scene like that you knew was so important for that character.
Yeah, that Casey and I actually talked about this recently. Like in the novel, that is a good example of where I had to sort of go in a different direction from the novel. And in the novel, it's played for comedy in many ways, and Ellen makes a PowerPoint presentation and has time to prepare one, and I knew that the engine of film story wasn't going to allow me to take that break. I just needed to keep going. And so Ellen had to sort of approach this scene completely unawares, completely taken off guard by it, and just go. So for me, what that scene ended up being, as I was writing it, and then as I started to work on set with Uma and Taylor, it really ended up being the scene that I wish that when I'd had with my parents when I came out to them in the 90s, late 90s, I should say, very, very late 90s, like so late into the 90s, it was practically midnight.
New Year's Eve, 1999.
New Year's Eve, that's right. And I really wanted to gift to the queer audience the kind of ultimate badass mom response, right? And I followed Casey's lead, and I just gave Ellen like the thing that I think I would have loved to have heard from my mom. But my mom at that time was just, you know, that wasn't something that was available to her. I think she's a lot closer to Ellen now. But I needed that. I wanted Ellen to be as spectacular as Uma plays her in the film, of just like and I wanted to be like, and that's my president, right? that 1-2 punch of mom being that cool and the president being that cool.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, for you, Casey, you know, you've had such a deep and long relationship with this book that you've created, and now you've had the opportunity to kind of see it go out into the world with readers, but then also to see how Matthew's imagination captured it on screen. And so how do you feel like that's expanded and evolved the relationship that you have with your own book and your own writing and work?
That's such a good question. I mean, it's I'm like struggling to come up with words. It's, you know, I guess I would start by saying I recently reread the Lord of the Rings series for the first time in a long time. And I realized how much they changed the character of Aragorn's arc. And it showed me, and this was like before the movie came out, but it showed me that sometimes changes that are made for a movie are good and even better than the original because it's a movie. And a movie has to be a movie and a book has to be a book. And 400 pages of book is never going to be an hour and a half to 2 hours of a movie. And as an author, I think we can be a little precious about, well, this is what I wrote and this is what I've been attached to. You know, I started writing this book in early 2016, so like 8 years ago. And for all of those years, it was this way in my head, and it was, you know, there was never a different way. And then you start to figure out that the heart of it is really what matters. And if you read the script and you feel like the heart of what you wrote is in there, and the characters are getting from their point A to their point B, and the same point A that you believe in and the same point B that you believe in, but like a few little turns are different along the way, that it can actually be this really beautiful, transformative way to tell the story, that kind of, even for me, even for readers, can open up a different way to appreciate it, a different way to like love these characters, and love the story that they're inside. And it was honestly a really freeing thing to realize and to experience, because suddenly you're like, what an amazing, expansive piece of art that can now be more than me. It kind of takes the pressure off me a little bit, because I'm like, wow, like there's so many different versions of this story, you know, there's so many different angles and so many different facets that you can like find yourself in or plug into. And that I think is really beautiful and makes me appreciate this whole process so much more.
I love that. Well, congratulations on all of the success of the book and the continued evolution into the movie and everything with the film. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.